The narcissist does not fear abandonment the way most people imagine. They are not undone by someone leaving in anger, grief, or self-respect. Those exits are familiar. They are loud, emotional, and still centered on the narcissist's gravity. Even rejection confirms relevance. Even hatred maintains connection. What truly destabilizes the narcissistic psyche is something far colder and far more final. The moment an empath stops feeling anything at all. Not love, not resentment, not disappointment, just nothing. No charge, no pull, no emotional signal to orient around. That moment does not feel like being left behind. It feels like falling out of reality. And for a narcissist, that is the most dangerous psychological condition imaginable. A narcissist is not built to self-regulate. Their sense of coherence depends on continuous emotional exchange with others. They require feedback, positive or negative, to remain internally organized. Admiration gives them elevation. Conflict gives them definition. Pain gives them leverage. Even emotional collapse in the other person reassures them of impact. The system works as long as something is coming back. The empath plays a singular role in this system because the empath does more than respond. They stabilize. They absorb volatility without reflecting it back. They remain emotionally present without escalating or retaliating. Over time, the empath becomes an unspoken psychological anchor. Not a partner in the traditional sense, but a regulating field the narcissist unconsciously relies on to avoid inner disintegration. This reliance is never acknowledged, but it is absolute. Because of this, the narcissist consistently misinterprets the empath's endurance. What is actually strength is read as tolerance. What is actually discernment is read as softness. The narcissist assumes the empath stays because they cannot leave, not because they are choosing to hold something together. This assumption becomes fatal. It licenses escalation. Boundaries are crossed not out of cruelty, but out of certainty that nothing fundamental will break. The narcissist believes pain creates control. They believe endurance proves dependency, and they do not realize that the empath is not staying out of weakness, but out of containment until the containment quietly ends. When it ends, there is no rupture, no scene, no confrontation. The empath does not announce withdrawal. They do not demand understanding. They do not need closure. Something simply disengages internally. The empath becomes emotionally neutral, calm, unresponsive in the only way that ever mattered. They may still speak. They may still function. They may still be present in form. But the emotional field that once held the narcissist's inner chaos has disappeared. And this is where the narcissist's greatest fear begins, not as panic, but as disorientation. There is nothing to provoke and nothing to fix. The familiar levers no longer work. The system loses its reference point. From the lens of depth psychology, particularly in the work of Carl Jung, this moment marks a structural rupture. When the shadow cannot be consciously integrated, it must be contained elsewhere. The empath often serves as that unconscious container, holding disowned emotion, shame, and instability without forcing exposure. This arrangement allows the narcissist to function without self-confrontation. When the empath stops performing this role, the shadow returns inward without mediation. This is not experienced as insight or growth. It is experienced as threat, as internal fragmentation, as a loss of cohesion that cannot be named or explained. And because there is no clear external cause, the anxiety becomes pervasive and unmanageable. This is why the empath, who feels nothing anymore, becomes the narcissist's biggest fear. Anger could be fought, sadness could be exploited, love could be controlled, but emotional absence cannot be negotiated with. It does not respond to pressure or performance. It offers no entry point. The narcissist is left alone with the parts of themselves they were never meant to face. Not dramatically, not visibly, but permanently. This fear is not about losing the empath as a person. It is about losing access to a psychological position that made life bearable without self-awareness. Once that position collapses, it cannot be restored. This video is not about revenge or closure. It is about understanding why the quiet moment you stopped feeling became the most destabilizing psychological event the narcissist will ever endure. If the narcissist's greatest fear begins when the empath feels nothing, it is because of a fatal misunderstanding that formed long before that moment. The narcissist never believed the empath was choosing to stay. They believed the empath had no real alternative. This belief is subtle, but it governs everything that follows. To the narcissist, endurance is not interpreted as strength or discernment. It is interpreted as tolerance. Compassion is not read as self-control. It is read as softness. And emotional availability is not experienced as a conscious gift, but as a resource that can be drawn from indefinitely. This misinterpretation is not malicious in intent. It is structural. The narcissist's psyche cannot register voluntary containment because it does not recognize internal limits in the same way. From the narcissist's internal logic, power is measured by what can be taken without consequence. Pain becomes a diagnostic tool. If someone remains present after being hurt, the narcissist concludes that the bond has deepened, not that damage has been done. Each boundary crossed becomes proof that another boundary can be crossed. Each forgiveness becomes evidence that forgiveness will always arrive. Over time, this logic creates a dangerous illusion that the empath's presence is unconditional and therefore permanent. The narcissist does not ask, "How much can this person hold?" They assume the answer is infinite. And because the empath does not immediately collapse, retaliate, or withdraw, the narcissist never learns where the true limit is. What the narcissist fails to perceive is that the empath's endurance is not passive. It is an active psychological function. The empath is not staying because they cannot leave. They are staying because they are regulating something that feels unstable, fractured, or unsafe in the other person. They sense, often without words, that if they disengage too quickly, something will unravel. This is not self-sacrifice in the dramatic sense. It is containment. The empath absorbs volatility, smooths emotional spikes, and carries unresolved tension so that the system remains intact. None of this is verbalized. None of it is negotiated. And because it is invisible, the narcissist never recognizes it as labor. This invisibility is what makes the misjudgment so complete. The narcissist confuses containment with compliance. They assume that because the empath does not escalate, there is nothing to escalate against. They push harder, not to punish, but to test. They provoke not out of cruelty, but out of certainty that the structure will hold. And it does until it doesn't. The narcissist believes pain creates control, because pain has never removed the empath before. In their mind, hurt has always been followed by repair, explanation, or forgiveness. This creates a closed feedback loop in which escalation feels safe. The narcissist is not preparing for abandonment because abandonment has never been signaled. What they are preparing for is permanence. This is why the empath's eventual emotional withdrawal is so incomprehensible to the narcissist. From the outside, nothing dramatic happened. There was no final betrayal, no singular act that clearly explains the shift. The narcissist searches for a moment where the empath decided to leave, but such a moment does not exist. The withdrawal was not a decision. It was an internal threshold being crossed. The empath did not wake up one day and choose detachment. Detachment emerged when the cost of containment exceeded what the psyche could continue to bear without self-erasure. By the time this happens, the empath is no longer negotiating. They are reorganizing. This is the point where the narcissist's fear begins to incubate, even if they do not recognize it yet. They sense that something has changed, but they misinterpret it. They assume the empath has adapted. They believe the calm signals acceptance. In reality, the calm signals disengagement at a level they cannot perceive. The narcissist does not escalate immediately because there is no resistance to overcome. There is no emotional friction. This false calm allows the empath's withdrawal to deepen uninterrupted. And when the narcissist finally realizes that the emotional supply is no longer accessible, the system has already lost its stabilizing function. The tragedy of this misjudgment is that it was preventable only in theory, not in practice. For the narcissist to recognize the empath's containment as a choice rather than a weakness, they would have needed to acknowledge dependency. They would have needed to see that their stability was not self-generated. That acknowledgement is structurally intolerable. So the misinterpretation persists. The narcissist believes they were abandoned without warning, when in fact they exhausted something essential without ever seeing it as finite. This is why the empath who feels nothing anymore becomes such a destabilizing presence in memory. The narcissist cannot reconcile the past version of the empath, warm, responsive, emotionally present, with the current neutrality. The gap between those two states produces anxiety without explanation. The narcissist keeps searching for leverage that no longer exists. They replay interactions, test boundaries, and revisit old behaviors, expecting the old reactions to return. But the function they relied on has ended. Not because the empath became cold, but because the empath stopped carrying what was never theirs to hold indefinitely. The narcissist's greatest fear does not emerge when they realize the empath has left. It emerges when they realize the empath was never staying for the reasons they assumed. And by the time this realization approaches consciousness, it is already too late. The misunderstanding has done its work. The system has lost its regulator. And the fear that follows is not fear of loss, but fear of exposure to an inner instability that was always there, now without a buffer. By the time the empath stops feeling, the dynamic has already passed a point of no return. What most people imagine as walking away is not what actually happens here. There is no dramatic exit, no final declaration, no emotional rupture that announces itself as an ending. The empath's withdrawal is not an event. It is a quiet internal shift, a reorganization that occurs beneath language and beneath conscious intention. This is precisely why it is so destabilizing to the narcissist. There is nothing to point to, nothing to argue with, nothing to correct. The ground simply disappears. For a long time, the empath has been emotionally present in ways that do not register as visible effort. They listen without demanding. They absorb tension without amplifying it. They remain calm when chaos would be justified. Over time, this presence becomes habitual not only for the narcissist, but for the empath as well. The empath does not mark each moment of endurance as a cost. They do not keep a ledger. They do not threaten departure. They continue, believing often unconsciously that holding steady is preferable to letting something collapse. This is why the threshold is crossed silently. The empath does not decide to stop caring. Caring simply stops working. What ends is not affection. It is not goodwill. It is not even hope in the obvious sense. What ends is emotional investment as a regulatory function. The empath no longer feels compelled to stabilize what is unstable. They no longer feel responsible for smoothing what continually sharpens. This shift does not feel like anger or resentment. It feels like neutrality, a kind of internal stillness that does not need to be defended. The empath does not feel vindicated. They do not feel superior. They feel done, not exhausted, but complete. The work has ended. From the narcissist's perspective, this is profoundly confusing. The empath is still there in form, at least initially. The tone is calm. The surface behavior may even appear cooperative. There is no overt resistance. This leads the narcissist to misread the situation yet again. They assume adaptation. They believe the empath has finally accepted the terms of the dynamic. The absence of conflict is interpreted as success. The narcissist does not escalate because escalation requires resistance, and resistance has vanished. This misinterpretation allows the empath's detachment to deepen uninterrupted. But beneath the surface, the narcissist begins to sense something is wrong, not immediately as fear, but as a subtle loss of orientation. The usual emotional cues are gone. The empath no longer mirrors distress. They no longer absorb volatility. They no longer respond with the familiar emotional texture that once organized the narcissist's inner state. Conversations feel flatter. Interactions feel hollow. There is less friction, but also less grounding. The narcissist cannot name what is missing because what is missing was never consciously recognized in the first place. This is the paradox of the empath's emotional withdrawal. It creates calm on the surface and instability underneath. The narcissist is not confronted. They are not challenged. They are quietly deprived of the psychological function that kept their inner world coherent. There is no anger to manage, no sadness to exploit, no reassurance to extract. The empath's neutrality offers no leverage. And because the narcissist is oriented toward reaction rather than reflection, this absence becomes deeply unsettling. At this stage, the narcissist may begin to test the system, not aggressively at first. Subtle provocations appear small boundary violations, familiar emotional hooks, mild manipulations designed to reawaken the old responses. When these attempts fail, confusion increases. The narcissist may oscillate between irritation and nostalgia, between dismissiveness and sudden interest. None of it works, because the empath is no longer emotionally available in the way the system requires. The container is gone. Crucially, this withdrawal is not reversible. This is not emotional numbing that will lift with reassurance. It is not withdrawal designed to punish or teach a lesson. The empath is not withholding. They are no longer holding. The difference is essential. Withholding implies control. No longer holding implies completion. The empath has crossed an internal threshold beyond which the old role cannot be resumed without self-betrayal. Even if the narcissist were to change their behavior temporarily, the empath would not re-enter the same psychological position. The structure that supported it no longer exists. This is why the narcissist's fear does not erupt immediately. It grows slowly, in the background, as a persistent sense that something essential has been lost without explanation. The narcissist may feel restless, unfocused, or subtly agitated. Their usual methods of self-regulation no longer produce the same effect. Distractions feel thinner. New sources of stimulation fail to ground them. They are not yet consciously afraid, but the conditions for fear are forming. The internal system is destabilizing, and there is no external cause to blame. For the empath, this phase is marked by clarity rather than turmoil. The absence of emotional charge creates space. The empath no longer needs to rehearse conversations, anticipate reactions, or manage outcomes. There is relief, but not celebration. The empath does not feel powerful. They feel free of a role they never consented to play indefinitely. This quiet clarity is precisely what the narcissist cannot access or understand. From the outside, it looks like nothing. From the inside, it is a fundamental reorganization. This is the moment where the dynamic truly ends, even if contact continues for a time. The narcissist has not yet grasped the magnitude of what has occurred. They may believe there is still time, still leverage, still a way to re-engage the old emotional loop. But the empath is already psychologically absent, not withdrawn in anger, not distant in grief, simply unreachable in the way that mattered most. The emotional field that once stabilized the narcissist's inner chaos is gone, and no performance can recreate it. This moment, quiet, unmarked, and often unnoticed, is the origin point of the narcissist's greatest fear. Not the fear of being left, but the fear of being alone with themselves, without a buffer. The empath's emotional neutrality does not announce itself as an ending. It functions as one. And by the time the narcissist begins to sense the depth of the loss, the system that depended on the empath's presence has already started to unravel from within. What finally emerges in the narcissist is not sadness, and it is not longing in the human sense. It is fear, but not the kind that comes from loss. It is the fear that comes from exposure. This is the point where the narcissistic system begins to break down, not because the empath is gone, but because the psychological function the empath was performing has disappeared. To understand why this fear is so profound, it must be understood not relationally, but structurally. What the empath provided was not affection, loyalty, or emotional labor in the ordinary sense. What the empath provided was containment. In-depth psychology, particularly in the work of Carl Jung, containment refers to the unconscious process by which disowned psychic material is held, regulated, or stabilized through another person when it cannot be integrated internally. When an individual cannot tolerate certain emotions, impulses, or vulnerabilities within themselves, those elements do not disappear. They are displaced. They seek a container. In the narcissistic structure, this container is almost always external. The narcissist survives by locating regulation outside the self. The empath becomes uniquely suited to this role because they do not immediately reject, retaliate, or expose what they encounter. They hold it, quietly, without demanding integration. Over time, the empath absorbs aspects of the narcissist's shadow that the narcissist cannot face directly. Unprocessed shame, fragile self-worth, dependency that contradicts the grandiose image, emotional volatility that would feel annihilating if fully acknowledged. None of this is spoken, none of it is agreed upon, but it is relied upon absolutely. The empath's presence allows the narcissist to feel internally coherent without ever becoming self-aware. This is why the relationship feels stabilizing to the narcissist even as it drains the empath. The empath is not simply loving the narcissist. They are unconsciously buffering them from themselves. When the empath stops feeling, when neutrality replaces emotional responsiveness, that buffer collapses. And what returns inward is not insight. It is pressure. The shadow does not re-enter the psyche gently. It arrives as fragmentation. Thoughts lose cohesion. Emotions surface without context. Anxiety appears without cause. The narcissist does not suddenly see themselves. Instead, they experience a loss of internal gravity. There is no longer a place for disowned material to land. And because the narcissist lacks the capacity for conscious shadow integration, this internal pressure feels intolerable. This is the true origin of the narcissist's fear. It is not fear of abandonment, because abandonment can be explained, blamed, and externalized. It is fear of internal exposure without mediation. The empath's withdrawal removes the final barrier between the narcissist and their own uncontained inner life. And because there is no language for this experience, the fear does not announce itself clearly. It appears as restlessness, as agitation, as a sense that something is fundamentally wrong but impossible to locate. The narcissist may describe it as boredom, dissatisfaction, or emptiness. But beneath those labels is a deeper panic. The system no longer holds. This fear intensifies because it cannot be managed through the usual narcissistic strategies. Control does not work because there is nothing to control. Charm does not work because there is no emotional field to enter. Provocation does not work because neutrality offers no friction. The narcissist is left without leverage. And leverage is how the narcissistic psyche organizes reality. Without it, they are forced into proximity with their own shadow, not consciously, but somatically and emotionally. This proximity is experienced as threat rather than opportunity. Integration would require tolerance of shame, limitation, and dependency. These are precisely the experiences the narcissistic structure is designed to avoid. As this fear grows, the narcissist may attempt substitution. They seek new relationships, new stimulation, new intensity. But substitutes fail because the function that was lost was not interchangeable. Admiration can inflate the ego, but it cannot contain instability. Novelty can distract, but it cannot regulate. Conflict can energize, but it cannot ground. The empath's containment was specific, sustained, and relationally embedded. It cannot be replicated by someone who does not unconsciously absorb and hold the narcissist's shadow. And because this function was never recognized, the narcissist does not know what to look for. They only know that nothing feels the same. This is why the empath becomes central in the narcissist's internal world after emotional withdrawal, even if the narcissist does not consciously miss them. The empath represents the last point of internal coherence. Not happiness, not fulfillment, coherence. The narcissist does not long for the empath as a person. They long for the psychological stability that existed in that relational space. And because that stability depended on the empath's willingness to hold what should never have been outsourced, it cannot be restored without the empath's participation, which is no longer available. Importantly, this fear does not lead to growth. It does not soften the narcissist into accountability. Fear alone does not produce integration. Without the capacity for reflection, fear produces defense. The narcissist responds by tightening control, increasing performance, or further dissociating from depth. They may become more charming, more distant, or more erratic. All of these behaviors are attempts to manage the internal pressure without confronting its source. The shadow presses inward, and the defenses harden outward. This is why the narcissist's biggest fear remains largely invisible to others. From the outside, they may appear functional, successful, even improved. But internally, something essential has been lost. The experience of being psychologically held without exposure is gone. The empath's withdrawal has forced a permanent shift. The narcissist now lives without a container for their disowned inner life. And because they cannot name this loss without acknowledging dependency, the fear remains unspoken. It becomes a background condition rather than a conscious realization. The empath does not witness this fear. They do not need to. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself as suffering. It operates quietly, shaping the narcissist's future relationships and behaviors without ever being resolved. Every new connection is approached with more control and less depth. Every moment of stillness becomes uncomfortable. The narcissist may keep moving, but there is no longer a place to rest psychologically. This is the cost of losing containment. The empath, who feels nothing anymore, is terrifying to the narcissist not because of rejection, but because neutrality exposes a truth the narcissistic system cannot survive confronting. That their stability was never internal, it was borrowed. And once that borrowed structure collapses, it cannot be rebuilt through effort, charm, or time. The fear that emerges is not fear of losing the empath. It is fear of having no place left to put what they cannot face within themselves. And that fear does not fade. It settles in. At this stage, many people expect the narcissist's fear to turn into remorse. They assume that once the empath withdraws and the internal system destabilizes, the narcissist will finally understand what they did and feel genuine regret. This assumption is understandable, but it is psychologically incorrect. What forms inside the narcissist is not moral regret. It is structural disturbance. And the difference between those two determines everything that follows. Moral regret requires a stable sense of self that can look backward, accept responsibility, and tolerate guilt without collapsing. It requires the capacity to hold two truths at once. I caused harm, and I can remain intact while acknowledging it. The narcissistic structure lacks this capacity. Accountability threatens annihilation. To admit fault would require contact with shame, limitation, and dependency, precisely the contents of the shadow that the narcissist has spent a lifetime avoiding. As a result, the fear triggered by the empath's withdrawal does not soften into empathy. It hardens into defense. This is why the narcissist's internal disturbance never matures into insight. Instead of asking, "What did I do?" the narcissist asks, often unconsciously, "What am I losing?" The focus remains external. The problem is framed as deprivation rather than damage. Something essential is gone, but it is not recognized as a consequence of behavior. It is experienced as an inexplicable loss of internal regulation. And because the narcissist cannot link the disturbance to their own actions without self-fragmentation, the psyche reroutes the distress into coping mechanisms that preserve the grandiose self-image. One of the most common manifestations of this rerouting is nostalgia. The narcissist may begin to idealize the past, recalling the empath as the only one who understood me, or the one I was most myself with. On the surface, this can look like regret, but psychologically, it is not an acknowledgement of harm. It is an attempt to reattach to a stabilizing memory. The empath is remembered not as a person who was wounded, but as an environment that once made the narcissist feel coherent. The past becomes a refuge, not a reckoning. Another manifestation is reach-out behavior that lacks substance. Messages appear that are vague, indirect, or emotionally ambiguous. Apologies, if they surface at all, are incomplete and strategic. They do not name harm. They do not accept responsibility. They are designed to test access, not to repair rupture. The narcissist is not seeking forgiveness in the ethical sense. They are seeking relief from internal pressure. And because the empath is no longer emotionally available as a container, these attempts fail to produce the regulation the narcissist is unconsciously seeking. This failure intensifies the disturbance. The narcissist may respond by escalating in other directions. Control behaviors increase, performance becomes more exaggerated, new relationships are pursued with urgency. But none of these strategies address the underlying deficit. The lost function cannot be replaced by attention, admiration, or novelty. What was lost was not supply, it was containment. And containment cannot be demanded, performed, or purchased. It requires a particular relational configuration that no longer exists. At this point, the narcissist's fear settles into a chronic state. It no longer feels acute or dramatic. It becomes a background instability that colors everything. The narcissist may appear functional, even successful, but the internal coherence that once existed in the empath's presence does not return. Moments of stillness become uncomfortable. Emotional depth becomes threatening. Relationships are managed rather than lived. The narcissist may not consciously miss the empath, but they miss the version of themselves that existed in that relational space. This is why the narcissist often repeats the same relational pattern with new people, not because they have not learned, but because repetition is an attempt to recreate a lost function. They unconsciously search for someone who will absorb volatility, stabilize insecurity, and hold emotional chaos without demanding integration. But each repetition fails, and each failure deepens the disturbance. The narcissist begins to sense that something was permanently damaged, yet remains unable to articulate what it was. This gap between felt loss and conceptual understanding is the source of their enduring discomfort. Crucially, this discomfort does not motivate change. Growth would require the narcissist to sit with inner instability without outsourcing it. It would require tolerating shame and limitation long enough for integration to occur. But the narcissistic structure is organized to prevent exactly this process. Instead of integration, the narcissist relies on movement, new connections, new identities, new performances. Motion replaces reflection. Activity replaces presence. And the fear remains unaddressed. What makes this fear particularly corrosive is that it offers no resolution. It cannot be externalized without losing coherence. It cannot be internalized without confronting the shadow. The narcissist is trapped between two intolerable options, so the psyche chooses the third, avoidance. The fear becomes diffuse, unnamed, and constant. It informs behavior without ever being examined. And because it is never consciously processed, it does not fade with time. It fossilizes. This is why the narcissist's biggest fear never transforms into healing regret. Healing would require the very capacities the narcissist lacks: self-reflection without collapse, responsibility without annihilation, vulnerability without defense. The empath's withdrawal exposes this limitation but does not correct it. The narcissist continues forward with a diminished inner world, not punished, not redeemed, but narrowed. The empath does not need to confront this fear, explain it, or witness its effects. The consequence has already occurred at the level that matters most. The narcissist's fear is not a moment, it is a condition. It shapes future relationships, decisions, and emotional range without ever being named. And because it is structural rather than moral, no apology, insight, or passage of time can dissolve it. The narcissist does not regret hurting the empath, because regret would require empathy. They fear losing the empath, because losing the empath exposed the truth they cannot integrate, that their sense of stability was never internal, it was borrowed. And once that borrowed structure collapses, fear becomes the permanent cost. What ultimately remains is not a dramatic ending, not a reversal, and not a moral lesson that brings closure. What remains is consequence. The narcissist does not lose the empath in the way stories usually describe loss. They lose the only relational position in which they could exist without constant self-fragmentation. They lose the experience of being emotionally held without being exposed, mirrored without being confronted, stabilized without being required to integrate. And that loss does not announce itself loudly. It settles in quietly and permanently. The empath's withdrawal was never an act of punishment. It was not strategy, revenge, or emotional withholding. It was the natural result of a psychological function reaching its limit. The empath did not take something away. They stopped supplying what should never have been outsourced in the first place. And when that supply ends, the narcissistic system does not collapse outwardly, it narrows inwardly. Life continues, relationships continue, performance continues, but something essential no longer operates beneath the surface. This is why the narcissist's biggest fear is not being left, replaced, or forgotten. Those experiences can be explained, they can be dramatized, they can be blamed on others. The true fear is far quieter. Being left alone with an inner world that no longer has a container. An inner world that produces pressure without language, anxiety without narrative, and instability without relief. As described in the work of Carl Jung, what is not integrated does not disappear. It demands payment in limitation. And that payment shapes the remainder of the narcissist's relational life. For the empath, this ending requires no validation. There is nothing left to prove and no outcome to witness. The shift already occurred at the deepest level. Emotional neutrality did what confrontation never could. It ended a dynamic that depended entirely on the empath's willingness to carry what was never theirs to carry. The empath does not need acknowledgement, apology, or recognition. The consequence has already taken effect where it matters most. If there is clarity to take from this, it is not about the narcissist. It is about understanding the power of withdrawal that is not reactive, not angry, and not performative. The moment the empath stopped feeling was not a moment of loss. It was a moment of reorganization. And once that reorganization is complete, the old structure cannot be restored. Not through charm, not through time, not through repetition. The narcissist moves forward with a world that still functions, but no longer feels held. And the empath moves forward without the weight of containment that was slowly erasing them. This is not justice in the dramatic sense. It is balance, quiet, structural, and irreversible. And that is why the empath who feels nothing anymore remains the narcissist's greatest fear, not because of what they did, but because of what they are no longer willing to be.